Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of Gaming Outside the Algorithm. Goda is my weekly gaming business and technology focused solo cast, where I try and cover some additional topics, things that I don't get an opportunity to cover on some of the other podcasts I'm on. So without much further ado, let's get to it. And I should add, a focus on gaming, business and technology, devoid of a lot of the back and forth that happens on Twitter, since I am essentially entirely off that site. So without much further ado, let's get to it, because we have a lot of stuff to go through tonight. I'm trying to decide if this one recording session is going to be the show. I don't think it's going to be in its entirety. Tomorrow I do want to go over some of the data that's coming back from the GDC survey. So I don't have that teed up for tonight. Oh, and also go over PC component pricing and kind of see where prices sit this week. So without much further ado, let's get to it with the stuff that we have on deck tonight. So starting with this news story over on GameIndustry.biz, anger and despair reigning supreme at Ubisoft following restructuring plans as union. French games industry union Solidaires Informatique planning further action in response. That's according to French games industry union Solidaires Informatique, which organized a strike last Thursday, January 22nd, as the initial answer to the absurdity of management's decisions. As reported by Le Monde, around 10 people attended the protest. Solidaires Informatique confirmed it is planning further action both in France and elsewhere with other unions at Ubisoft. The union called for an end to Ubisoft's cost-cutting plan, maintaining and extending remote work and decent pay raises this year. A quote from Marc Rouchle, who is the union representative. At this stage, it seems clear to us that Yves Guillemot has no knowledge or understanding of his company or its employees, the union representative told GameIndustry.biz. So my thoughts on this. So this is pretty much a wait and see for me to get a sense of what the actual temperature is in the Ubisoft employee base. Anger and despair does not quite equate with me to 10 employees showing up for a strike. Now, admittedly, maybe that's because the word went out at the last minute on the approach to the weekend in a country where I think it's a 4-day work week. That being said, I did pull the thread. Ubisoft Paris itself is not on a 4-day work week. In fact, the preceding walkout that is discussed in the article, when 700 people went out for 3 days in protest, I think last year, was over a demand for a 4-day work week, which was a demand that was not adopted. So the 4-day work week, actually, I pulled that thread and did that research. I thought it was interesting to include that in the information. But I think this was just a matter of if I remember the timeline correctly, I think these decisions went down and got put out on a Wednesday, and then there was this effort to organize a protest on a Thursday. And so possibly not a lot of people showed up for it. That's one of the potential reasons. The other potential reason was people are not in anger and despair, as much as the headline says and as much as the quote from the union representative indicates. Now I do not doubt that some of the employee base is mad, nor that they have reason to be, right? They absolutely have some inkling of a reason to be mad about what's going on. I'm just trying to assess just exactly how mad they are and how many people are mad. What doesn't ring true to me is what is in the demands, which is to a certain extent, unless there's more meat on the bones in terms of defining exactly what it is the union is asking for, to better define it. So the union is calling for an end to the cost-cutting plan. That is not realistic. This company is down bad as of their last annual earnings report. And I pulled it up. That's market cap. So this is their last earnings report. I think maybe annual or quarterly. I'm not exactly sure, but as of their, those aren't the figures. I don't think that's the ones I wanted to look at. is very late. I've been shoveling snow for the last 2 days, so I'm probably just a little less put together than I wanted to be. There was a chart that was in here that was crap. Net bookings of 772.4 million, up 20.3% year over year. Non-IFRS operating income. Yeah, I apologize. I may have to record this segment over again. Because this isn't even in the chart that is in my notes. The chart that's in my notes, so I'm not sure if I can. Yeah, I can't bring that up on the screen easily. So in their 2025 closeout earnings report, their net bookings were down 20.5%. Their IFRS 15 sales were down 17.5%. Net bookings were down 8.3%. Back catalog net bookings down 13.5%. IFRS operating income was a negative 82.6 million euros, and their non-IFRS reporting income was a negative 15.1 million euros. So I'm not sure, maybe I pulled the wrong earnings report or the wrong chart in that bookmark, but everything was negative right at the end of last year. So in their fiscal year 25 and 26, they report their guidance that they give is net bookings. They look for net bookings to be stable year on year, approximately break even non-IFRS operating income, and negative free cash flow, reflecting the group's transformation. So what they're reporting for guidance for their future outlook, for the way things should be looking now, right, as of their last earnings report, is that they would expect negative free cash flow reflecting the group's transformation. So this reorganization that they're doing right now, they expect to still be losing money. Following the closing of the Tencent transaction, the group expects to maintain a consolidated net debt position of around zero. So in earnings, they expect to be losing a little money. In terms of their total debt, they expect that to remain zero. So whatever they're doing with debt to equity ratio and any borrowing of money that they're doing and any payback of money, because I'm certain some debt is being liquidated, they expect that to balance out to zero. Beyond 2025 and 2026, the group expects to return to positive non-IFRS operating income and free cash flow generation in FY 26 and 27, and to see it's FY 2026 to 27, and to see significant content coming from its largest brands in FY 26-27 and FY 27-28. So they expect to return to green the year after this restructure. So again, the picture I want to make sure is painted is when last fiscal year ended for them, they were down negative across the board. And the one thing also to be aware of is, and AMD has been doing this a little bit too, some of these companies have been reporting non-IFRS ratings, right, earnings, as part of their voice track, but then when you go and look at their actual earnings report, which has to be filed in accordance with IFRS, and IFRS is basically the European, an international, similar to standard to GAAP. So basically what these guys are saying is, hey, if you look at our earnings before we have to deduct everything, right, or make things less rosy based on accounting standards, then we're actually not that bad off, or we actually look good off. And I want to say in a recent quarter, AMD reported like non-GAAP earnings of, positive 3.5%. But then if you look at their actual GAAP earnings, they're actually negative, right? So it's a thing that kind of has to be paid attention to in order to understand this. And so again, I want to go back and apologize. I think that bookmark that I pulled either had the wrong report or was actually reporting their forward-looking guidance, not the other chart that I actually have in my notes for how they actually ended, I think is where the discrepancy was. So at any rate, you're not going to stop the company from cutting costs, right? That's my main point. To ask the company, hey, we want you to stop cutting costs. I'm like, no. If we don't stop cutting costs, there's not going to be an Ubisoft for us to be sitting here having a discussion about, right? That is a thing that needs to be understood. This other chart that I wanted to bring up on screen was, and actually you can't see this one that well. Yeah, for some reason it gives you the outline. It doesn't. It's not giving you the shaded section underneath it. But at any rate, the main thing I wanted you to see is if you were able to see this chart where this line is painted back in 2018 and again in 2021, Ubisoft was valuated at a market cap of just north of $12 billion, right? 12.42 billion. They peaked out in 30 July of 2018, and then they hit another similar too high of 12.47 billion in early 2021, February 2021. Ubisoft's market cap today is about $620 million, right? In comparison of their peak. So you're talking about worse than Nintendo, like Nintendo Wii era, right? Bathtubing. That is how bad off they are. They have bled $11-12 billion, right? Since 2021 is how bad things are. So again, I say you're not going to convince a company that's in that type of situation to just stop cutting costs. It's kind of a ridiculous ask, in my opinion. So like I said, it's kind of a ludicrous ask, and it's definitely at a point where the company is bathtubing out, and your response has to be, again, like I said, that if we don't continue to cut costs, there's not going to be a company for you to protest against. Maintaining the request to maintain and extend remote work. Yes, it is a definite measure. Right, and there's suspicion that, well, they're asking us to return to work so that when people refuse, they have a reason to let people go. Yes, you're correct. That is what they are trying to do. It's a definite measure to encourage voluntary separation. We're going to talk a little bit about 2 instances of voluntary separation here in a little bit. In this environment, I think you have to wait that there have been a ton of people in gaming experience, right? So if you're an employee or if you're a union member, you need to understand that there have been a ton of people with gaming experience who have been laid off, right, in the last few years, and more excessively in the last year or two. And so you might be, and so by choosing to not return to work, or in trying to fight this mandate to return to work, you might be gambling that there isn't somebody who would gladly take your place if it meant that they had to commute to the office. So if you kind of think about this in terms of kind of like a buyer's market and a seller's market, right? Who has the negotiating power? I think if you're on the employee side, if you're on the union side, you might want to consider that you might be in a precarious position in terms of negotiation leverage. And so, again, if there, that there might be somebody who's willing to take your place if that meant they had to commute into the office. I think that if we were in the bad times right after the post-pandemic crash, and as that was starting, you might have some more leverage there as an employee, right? The companies hadn't fully turned the corner and made the understanding that they weren't going to be making as much money as they thought they were going to be making forever during the pandemic. And so you had a moment in time where you could say, no, I'm not going to return to the office. Like, this is a new world, right? We were, as management, we were kind of all in that position where we were like, this is the new normal. People have different expectations. You're not going to be able to, drive people to return to work. And for a certain amount of time, when you looked at the big layoffs, when you looked at Amazon, when you looked at Microsoft, when you looked at Google, when those big layoffs were happening, a lot of us in smaller organizations were like, hey, go, we were telling our talent acquisition groups, go, snipe and look for the employees that have been laid off from these big companies, because there's a ton of talent that's now flooding the market. So there were those 2 blips in time. I think now, again, you might be at a position where there's talent available on the market. Maybe they haven't been picked up, right, by a medium or small size company. And I think you're taking a gamble if you think you're in the position where you can refuse to return to work. And I'm not saying that because I'm like rah the corporation and I'm happy about it. I'm making a tactical assessment of kind of what the landscape is right now. for these employees and making an objective assessment of what may happen with this back and forth between Ubisoft and the union. So at this point, this is a Warner Brothers Discovery kind of desperation move. If you remember Warner Brothers Discovery, right when that whole thing went down, they said, "Hey, we want to knock off $200 million worth of cost." I think they had a 1 year or 2 year horizon to do that. Here we kind of have the same thing, right? They're talking about they want to squeeze 200 million euro of cost out of the company in a year. And so there's a certain level of desperation, right, on the side of company ownership. And so it is that desperation move to try and get the cost back under a wire, and it's going to be tough to push against that. Again, if you think, you're going to fight it. Not getting any pay raises, I think, is the real issue. So they had three demands there. There was hey, stop the cost cutting, stop making, don't make us return to work, and we haven't gotten pay raises for the last few years, and we're hearing that you're not going to give us pay raises again. I think that's really your issue, right? You've got three issues. I kind of feel like, again, tactical assessment, 2 out of your 3 issues are kind of junk issues. And again, if you're to make another house buying analogy, if those are the 2 junk issues that you're putting on the table because you're actually not concerned as much about losing those and it's really you're fighting for the pay, because I got to tell you, it's very unlikely that Ubisoft is going to capitulate to, okay, we're going to compromise on the returning to the office mandate and we're going to give you pay. No, probably it's going to be, if we're going to give you pay raises, maybe that's okay. Maybe we'll do something about that, but you guys are going to return to the office 5 days a week, right? I can't see them compromising on both concurrently. So anyway, the not getting pay raises, I think, is the real issue. And I'm not sure it's directly relatable to the publicly disclosed changes that they are making, right? So they're making these restructuring changes and they're telling people about them and telling investors about them and telling, Wall Street and or the European equivalent, right? Of these changes that they're making. So these are things that they're required to be transparent about, to be compliant with the SEC and IFRS. But whether you are giving a raise to an employee or not is not a compliance item. That is not something they have to report. The other things they are doing, they do have to report, which means there's no mud on their nose by not giving raises, because that's not a reportable thing that they have to make transparent, right, to investors. They do have to report costs. And there's different, levels of precision and accuracy and full disclosure of where they, there's a lot of costs that just get junked into overhead, right? So my point is that is not a fight that they have political sensitivity about, because they don't have to tell anybody about it. Now, I mean, the union negotiations are going to get out, so that, that's going to be out there. But again, it is not I have to file this, right, with the accounting authorities. And so at any rate, my assessment is it may be a tough road to hoe to mix those topics together, and again, have a solid leg to stand on if this thing goes legal. So my hopes are for the best and the highest for those employees, but through my lens, I see a company that is rapidly moving towards the Apple position of 1997, right, where their assessment is probably like, hey, we're 90 days from solvency. Again, these guys have bled somewhere between 11 and 12 billion dollars in 4 years. And they now have a market cap of less than $1 billion total, right? 600 something million in total market cap. And so as a matter of advisement to engineers, right, because I am an engineering manager, portfolio director, program director. I've had an opportunity to mentor and coach hundreds, probably thousands of engineers, right, over, 20 plus years. And so if you're in one of those professions, right, if you're a knowledge worker, what I will say is you have to watch stuff like this, and you have to know, and you have to protect yourself, right? In these times at Ubisoft, if you were at Ubisoft, you should have been getting your resume dusted up a very long time ago. You should always keep in mind that unions do not directly prevent layoffs. They can soften the blow when it comes. They can help make sure you're better compensated. They can help fight for, what is the level of severance package that you get. But they cannot directly prevent it from happening. And on that topic, we have some more stuff to dig into, because, of course, the hits keep coming with Ubisoft. And so in this other article over on, I don't know why this is, yeah, I'm sorry, you guys cannot see that article headline. Something is going on with how I have it sized in OBS, but Ubisoft proposing 200 voluntary redundancies at its French headquarters. The publisher has stressed the voluntary mutual termination agreement remains a proposal at this stage. French publisher Ubisoft has proposed a round of voluntary redundancies that could result in up to 200 workers departing from the company's headquarters in Paris. As reported by IGN, Ubisoft has commenced a mutual termination plan that would allow workers to exit the company. The process requires workers to voluntarily choose to depart. Ubisoft must also agree to terms for those departures with employees and trade unions. The news comes less than a week after Ubisoft outlined plans to restructure its entire business around 5 creative houses and reduce its fixed costs based by $200 million over the next 2 years. The plan, which the company described as a reset, commenced with widespread project cancellations, including the long gestating Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, studio closures, and a return to office mandate that will require staff to work in office 5 days a week. So we talked about that. So the point is shortly after, the decisions they made and the effort supposedly by the union to try and fight it. Ubisoft put out this indication that it was negotiating with the union, or starting talks with the union and the employees, that we're going to do another round of voluntary layoffs. Now, if we skip over to this other story on GameIndustry.biz, and this was actually run back in October of 2025. At that point, Ubisoft was to offer voluntary redundancies to massive entertainment staff. Right, so this is part of how we got here in the first place. Reports claim voluntary career transition program is aimed at employees on permanent contracts waiting to be reassigned to new projects. So part of the precursor to this is Ubisoft tried to do a voluntary separation program last fall. And so one thing to get straight, right? It's a voluntary separation program. They're calling it a voluntary career transition program. Yeah, the transition is for you to transition out of the company, right? It is a voluntary separation program. That is the normal labor parlance with which these things are described. And so when these things happen at major corporations, there is a number that the corporation is targeting. And when that number is not hit, the next thing that follows that is for there to be non-voluntary layoffs. So that's, again, if you're an engineer, if you're a knowledge worker, if you're a salaried employee working at a major company, like, this is the sequence of events that you need to understand, right, is going down and is being coordinated, right, by management, like, outside of your purview. And so there was an effort to knock down headcount, specifically at Massive Entertainment staff. I suspect it was wider across the rest of the Ubisoft organization, or at least at some additional sites. They didn't hit the headcount they needed, and so part of that headcount was, part of what they squeezed out when they did this restructuring as well. And now they're trying to do it again, because now, as part of the restructuring, they have this, we gotta cut costs by 200 million euro in a year. And so watch out, because if they don't hit that number, which I don't think they're going to hit, they're going to try. I mean, they're putting this thing out. I don't think they're going to get the numbers that they need, particularly not just out of Paris. I'm guessing 200 million. I got to run the numbers on how many employees that might be, depending on salaries and whatnot. So we'll see. Yeah, I'm not exactly certain how that could be up, towards, a couple thousand employees. Ubisoft is a pretty large organization. They are north of 17,000, I think north of They were north of 20,000 before they started all of these layoffs. And so by now, they're probably still north of 17,000. So they may be trying to kind of get themselves down to about 15K. So getting 200 million people, getting $200 million worth of costs out of the organization could be as many as 2,000 employees, all depending on salary levels. And so, again, we'll kind of have to see how that turns out. Okay, I think that covers everything that I wanted to talk about with regards to Ubisoft. Just going to check my notes. Let's go ahead and skip over and start talking about a few PC topics. Actually, just one for this segment, and then we'll probably talk about a few more for the next one. This news story over on Hot Hardware by Zach Killian. Asus breaks silence on Ryzen 7 9800 X3D failures and launches an investigation. I mainly wanted to get this word out so that consumers were aware, PC enthusiasts were aware. You've probably heard about AMD Ryzen 3D V-Cache CPUs failing in ASRock motherboards, but ASRock is far from the only vendor seeing these failures, and it may not even be the most prominent one. Asus has now formally acknowledged the rare issue in a statement published today on its website titled Official Asus Statement on Recent Asus AMD 800 Series Motherboard and AMD Ryzen 9800 X3D Concerns. And this is the Asus statement. We are aware of recent reports concerning AMD Ryzen 7 9800 X3D CPUs and Asus AMD 800 Series motherboards, and we have initiated an immediate internal review. Our teams are conducting preventative checks on product compatibility and performance, working closely with AMD to validate reported cases and ensure ongoing stability and quality. We are looking to provide timely solutions to ensure our products and services meet expected standards. Users are also advised to update their Asus AMD 800 series motherboard to the latest BIOS via Asus Easy Flash or BIOS Flashback to help ensure system stability. We provide an official technical support FAQ with detailed instructions. Customers who are affected or have concerns are encouraged to contact Asus customer service for direct assistance. We take this matter seriously and value our customers' trust, and we remain committed to transparency and to ensuring our products can be used with confidence. My thoughts and notes on this. So, first of all, there are obviously other boards that work with AM5. You don't have to be on an X870 motherboard or X800 series motherboard. And so I would investigate compatibility. Like if you're targeting the 9800 X3D, and obviously the 9850 X3D came out, I think. And so there's now yet another part right on the market that you could choose. Although I would heavily suspect that that part could also run into the same problem, because if I'm not mistaken, those are basically binned 9800 X3Ds that hit higher performance standards. Not hugely higher. I think there's like a 5% performance bump that they're talking about you're seeing with the 9850 X3D. So I would be suspicious that that part is going to run into the same problem. So I would investigate compatibility. So if you're targeting either of those CPUs, I would look at what boards are those compatible with. There may be B850 or B840 boards that are out there that are compatible with those parts, I would suspect. As well as X670E and X670 or B650E and B650 boards that will work with those parts with a BIOS update. I actually have to check. I'm not absolutely. I may have made a mistake on that note. I'm not absolutely certain that there are B840 boards. So I'll double check on that in the next segment. But there are B800 series boards, we'll just call it that are compatible with those parts. A reminder that in most cases you have to get a working compatibility. So if you're going to target some of these other boards, some of which are from like prior generations, right before these CPUs came out. So a reminder that in most cases you have to get a working compatible CPU into a motherboard first to do the BIOS update, right? You can't, in most cases, I think there's one exception. There's a motherboard vendor that maybe allows you to somehow do this without a CPU, but in most cases you have to have a working CPU in the motherboard, right? So a CPU that the motherboard is already compatible with to do a BIOS update. So this route works best if you're coming from one of those boards already, and so you can update the BIOS before you swap out the processor. Might be a good idea to look at the MSI, so as other component options for a motherboard, besides these X800 series boards that are having problems. Might be a good idea to look at the MSI Tomahawk and Gigabyte Aorus boards. Those are some of the boards that some of the sites have recommended. Those also happen to be two of the boards that I have. So I run two B650s in the lab now with one type of each of those boards. So I have a B650 MSI Tomahawk and a B650 Gigabyte Aorus boards. In fact, the machine I'm on tonight that I'm doing the podcast from is a B650 board, Gigabyte Aorus, running a Ryzen 7950X CPU. And then the other one, the MSI, runs a 7800X3D. And so far, so good. No problems with either of those. Knock on wood. So again, root causes on these are not looking like a bad CPU design or a QA problem. So this is not like the Raptor Lake CPU problems that we had with the 13th and 14th gen desktop parts from Intel. And I'll also mention that's a partial correction on my part. I have been throwing around Raptor Lake and Meteor Lake when this topic has come up before, most recently since I started doing this particular version of the show. Well, of course, Meteor Lake was a laptop part, and the problems that Meteor Lake had were hitting quality marks at the fab, resulting in low yield. So, of course, those were caught before those chips ever shipped, and so they didn't become a consumer problem. So, Meteor Lake has its own sullied reputation, but in most cases, those problems were not problems that hit consumers. Consumers did get bit by the Raptor Lake problems, with those parts failing due to the VMin problem. So I think that is most of what I wanted to cover on that topic. Let's start talking about. It's kind of where we're kind of going to go through some of the quick hits, kind of in this segment one, because I actually went to gi.biz to pull the Capcom earnings, and I just saw a slew of topics that I kind of wanted to talk through. So these are kind of going to be loose and off the cuff. I obviously had some problems preparing for some other things in this segment. So these might be even rockier because these are not scripted. They're just the things that I pulled just prior to getting into this segment. Did I mention that it's very late at night and I have been shoveling snow for 2 days? So this first news story, Paradox operating profit dropped 162% year on year as it writes down Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. The Swedish firm admits that the game missed its commercial expectations. Swedish games firm Paradox Interactive has reported a 162% decrease in its operating profit for the 3 months ending December 31st, 2025. It is earnings week, by the way. Due to the poor performance of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodline 2. For the 3 months ending December 31st, 2025, revenue, they are Dutch, so I think this is they're either Dutch or Swedish. I can't remember. So I think this is the Swedish krona. Revenue, oh good, thank goodness GI Biz actually has it in dollars. So the total revenue was $98.7 million, up 23% year over year. But their operating profit was negative $27.7 million, down 162% year on year. And so this is the interesting thing. They actually made more money, but they were actually less profitable. This is a recurring topic that comes up many times with a lot of the things that pundits and propagandists offer, which is that if you just do X, you will make more money. Well, people without formal training in corporate finance and accounting, it is possible to make more money and actually lose money for your corporation because there is a stark difference between revenue and profit. And I am often confused why a lot of the commentators on the topics of the gaming industry don't separate that, don't talk about it, don't make sure they are very pointed and very clear and very precise when they're talking about those topics. And so this is great that we have an example of where that actually happened. That in this case, Paradox made more money than they had, up 23% year on year, and yet lost 162% of their profit. For the 12 months ending December 31st, 2025, Their total sales were $248.3 million, and so they were flat year on year. And then their operating profit was $16.5 million, an 80% decrease year on year. And so again, in similar vein, they made the roughly exact same amount of money that they made a year ago. However, it was an 80% decrease in profit. And hopefully this article gets into the reasons why. The company reported that it is writing down the cost of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 to the tune of $40.1 million. And that's part of the reason why. CEO Fred Wester said that the game did not meet our commercial expectations. As a result of the title, Paradox reported an operating loss of $27.7 million. And so it sounds like, I mean, the use of the term write down basically says it sounds to me like they're not accruing and recognizing any revenue against Vampire the Masquerade, probably because, if I'm not mistaken, that also allows them to not recognize any of the negative profit associated with it. They still have problems otherwise. What that also tells me is I think the budget for Vampire the Masquerades was that $27.7 million, because that's the write-down. I think, or at least fairly close to that. Despite Vampire's performance, Paradox still reported $98.7 million in revenue for its fourth quarter, a 23% increase year on year. This, Wester said, is largely due to the launch of grand strategy title Europa Universalis 5. And so one of the things that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes now is both this title and Anno, I can't remember what this one is, Anno 1717 or something, another 4X title that came out. I believe that's an Ubisoft title. Both of those things did well because Anno was in one of the tiered metal platforms of the Steam reports. So good to see that these 4X strategy games, of which I'm not a fan of these particular titles yet, but I am a fan of the 4X strategy genre. And so good to see that genre is performing well on the market, because we have absolutely had years where genres like this go away that are kind of niche, and they have rabid fan bases, but may not necessarily move the needle entirely. I mean, we've seen that with the erosion of RTS games from the time that they were kind of the peak of the PC gaming industry in the early 2000s to where, there's not nearly as many made today. This, Wester said, is largely due to the launch, which came out on November 4th and was developed by Paradox's Tinto Studio. For the full 2025 financial year, the Swedish firm, Swedish krona, brought in $248.3 million in sales, representing a 0.4% increase year on year. Operating profit across the full year was an 80% decline. Wester described Q4 as its most intense in Paradox's history and said that it is strengthening its strategic focus moving forward. With 2 new game releases, 1 remaster, and DLCs for most titles, we held a pace that truly demonstrates the strength of our organization and our portfolio. Just reading quickly through here to see if there's anything else of major import. He talks about Europa Universalis 5. What began as a niche title 25 years ago is today a textbook example of how we build long-lasting games with highly engaged communities. With this latest installment, we have taken significant steps forward and laid a very strong foundation for the future. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 started development at Hardsuit Labs shortly after Paradox acquired White Wolf, which owned the World of Darkness IP, in 2015. In 2021, the Swedish firm said that Hardsuit Labs was no longer working on the project, with UK developer The Chinese Room taking over the work in 2023. So that's kind of a sad result. I was a huge fan of Vampire the Masquerade back in, I don't remember when that game launched, 2003, 2005, something like that. It was an early 2000s game. It was pretty horrible at launch. It was one of those things where the community kind of saved it, and then I think all of the repairs and corrections that the community had made were eventually, I think, formally picked up by the developer and packaged in Vampire the Masquerade, I think. And so it actually became like one of the cult classic and really great RPGs years after. So it's kind of sad to see Bloodlines 2 kind of not stick the landing when it came out. The resilience Paradox is showing here, despite being down, is indicative of kind of what Rami Ishmael and some other members of a panel that are heavily involved in like venture capitalism and funding of projects and consulting and advising indie studios that I listened to last year. I think it was when Restructuring was still at GI.biz and they were still doing the GI.biz podcast. One of the things they mentioned is like, publishers that are strong are publishers that tend to have a very clear identity, either kind of in the flavor of content that they make. So, like a Devolver Digital at the time, they were including kind of Annapurna, and then things for Annapurna obviously kind of went south with all of their disputes, but then also like genres, right? So Paradox is a company that stands very firm on kind of a overall genre makeup of these 4X type games, and one of the things they mention is, in these trying times, that is the type of publisher that tends to have a lot of resilience, and so we'll see if things are able to kind of turn around for Paradox. This other news story over on GIDUP is, do we need better regulation in gaming following Bethesda's disastrous Fallout 4 reissue? This is actually an opinion piece, so I don't normally do opinion pieces, because everybody has one. I normally really try and stick to the actual news, right, in the facts that are reported about the industry, and then have my own assessment of them. But I did want to pull this article in because I wasn't aware. I didn't have any interest in the Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition, I guess, and so I didn't realize that apparently it was like severely buggy, which the Skyrim, the Oblivion remaster that came out last year also had kind of performance problems associated with it when it came out, so this caught my eye and I kind of wanted to take a look at it. So I'm just going to kind of speed through this quickly because I'm actually reading this for the first time myself. But this opinion piece over on GameIndustry.biz by Ryan Kushley-Spendiff, lecturer at Nottingham Law School. Bethesda experienced a lot of negative feedback following the release of Fallout 4 Anniversary Edition in November 2025, which broke many mods that have been created for the PC game over the past decade, as well as attracting complaints of crashes and glitches. So I knew about the mods breaking. I didn't understand that it had performance problems. Unfortunately, Bethesda is not the first major developer to fail to meet consumer expectations, nor by a country mile, nor is it the first to mishandle the situation. One cannot help but recall Creative Assembly, whose 2023 Shadows of Change expansion for Total War Warhammer 3 threatened to kill the series due to similar poor quality. It caused so much backlash that the company's vice president put out a letter of apology. These kinds of stories are increasingly common, but two questions arise. Is the fan base legally protected? And if not, does this signal the need for further regulation? The answer for the first question is barely, while the answer to the latter is that this is unlikely, but potentially for a good reason. One thing I'm going to say is absolutely in the case of America, because we have crappy consumer protection in comparison to, say, Australia, and also a lot of other overseas nations. In the UK, the current consumer protection for video games can be found within the Consumer Rights Act 2015, CRA, and the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations 2008. These give basic rights to all consumer transactions, including the right of satisfactory quality and that the goods are fit for a particular purpose. However, these provisions have aged oddly, with the games market now being one of continuous digital content development rather than singular transactions. There's little to prevent developers from providing continuous updates to games, including game-breaking hotfixes or radical changes to core mechanics. So, at this point in this topic, this is a very long opinion piece. First of all, thanks so much for everybody who's been coming through watching the show, and I certainly open this up to your opinion. So software development is a weird thing. So first of all, there are no warranties, right, on software in general. It is typically a thing that we abhor and that we don't issue, right, for software. And then for video games, if you go through and read, frequently advise people this who kind of have this whole like dialogue about, games and what they're owed. And I just want to be clear, again, this is for consumer awareness, not because I'm like, pack up your bags and just be satisfied with what you get. Like, if you go and you look at like the EULAs for some of these companies in the video, like if you go and look at the Rockstar EULA, the Rockstar EULA doesn't even guarantee you that the game will work, right? So you have no guarantee in most cases. You have no warranty. And so while this may have been a very egregious, like, stepping on the rake by Bethesda, the article is absolutely right. They're not the first. I'm not saying that to say that it's acceptable. I'm saying they're not the first. And I know for myself, and I still like screw this up. I need to get into this mode. I tell myself that I'm in this mode, but I don't follow it all the time. I say that, look, when I buy a game on Steam, if it doesn't work in any way, like I need to not troubleshoot, not try and follow due diligence, not try and be like a polite and courteous consumer. I just need to immediately file for a refund, because there is no there is no honor roll for being a nice person, right? With regards to interfacing with these companies. And like I said, I still screw this. I tried to turn an Xbox game in for a refund because I can't log into my Xbox account on Steam right now. And of course I get the standard thing that I always get from Steam anytime I try and file for a refund, and I've had the game for more than 2 hours, or I've run the game for more than 2 hours, or I've had the game for more than 2 weeks. I am also really bad about buying a game from Steam on a Steam sale and then not launching it or not using it and just immediately putting it in the backlog and like, okay, that's a rainy day game, I'll go check it out later. And that's what I did with some of these Xbox games. Although one of them I've had for a very long time, Halo Infinite, and I had actually just played it fine on December 5th, and suddenly on December 19th, I couldn't log into any of my Xbox games through Steam. So, again, there's not a ton of protections out there for consumers, at least in America. Does this mean we need more regulation? Yes, absolutely. Unquestionably. Are we going to get it? Probably not. I can't see, in America, again, I can't see Congress taking up the mantle of we need to protect consumers of video games, and therefore we're going to more tightly regulate things. And then there might be momentum that I could see behind them doing that for software, but unfortunately, in the chronology and the development of the industry, we have kind of transitioned through the time where I think there was an opportunity to really take on that dragon to where things are now software as a service. And you're not going to get, a company to kind of take a hit and issue a refund for software as a service. The nice thing about software as a service is there's an obligation to the company to make it work. Right, like you sign up for, let's take Adobe, right? You sign up for Adobe for $15 a month, $32 a month, whatever level you buy in at. I don't think Adobe's not going to have you sign up for the first month and then not have the software work, right? They're going to try and make it work or give you recommendations on how you can make it work. If it doesn't work, you're out $15, right? You're out the first month. Now, maybe it becomes a different issue if you've been investing in Adobe for a year and you've put a bunch of stuff in Adobe Cloud, and then all of a sudden it stops working, right? And now you have a year's worth or 2 years worth of money spent, and you can't use project files that you've created with the software. So that could be an issue. I think maybe if there is a window to take this on, again, part of the problem that the article cites is that video game companies now, with gas and even living games, right, this continuous delivery of DLC, there's kind of this notion that so many games have transitioned to service, and maybe there's an edge there for legal to stick its toe in the door and take on something from like a living game perspective, or software as a service perspective, and to try and provide the same type of, not necessarily protections, but at least obligatory follow through that a company should have to follow for something of that type of arrangement. But again, I think the I think the sliver of daylight that there is in the window for that to happen is very small, and so I don't know that it's practical to think that it's going to happen. I think one of the things that's curious for me, and again, I don't use mods, so even though I'm a heavy PC gamer, one of the things I don't do is mods, generally because I don't trust them. And I'm just not going to have non-commercial code running on one of my PCs that, you know, if it's malicious or it breaks, that there's not somebody that I can go to and blame and hold legally liable. I find it curious, like, in my mind, if I buy a remaster, remake, or reissue, my assumption is going to be that my mods aren't going to work. I read the collateral, I read the ad copy to find out if the mods are being accommodated, but I definitely assume that not all of them are going to work, that some of them are going to get broken. So it's kind of curious, because I think this is what I thought when I saw that some of these mods were being broken when this thing dropped last year. I found it curious that as many people had an expectation that all of their mods were going to work. So I don't know. So I don't know if that's the tripwire, right, that causes a bunch of congressmen to take up the mantle to go fight for protection of video gamers. But I do absolutely think that it's high time that, like, I feel like there does need to be legal intervention that looks at, like, the Steam return policy and says that's way overly draconian, right, to the point of being ridiculous. Like, you got to loosen that up a little. And then, quite honestly, even though people report that they've had different experiences with Xbox and PlayStation, there's always people who say, they always give me my money back, whatever. What the fact says is that if you buy a game and you download the game, you're not owed a refund. So what your personal experiences have been going through that, I don't know. I know that I ran into that problem on Xbox, and that's actually what one of the reasons that kind of caused me to more firmly be committed to Game Pass for a period of time. Was I was like, this is, at the time, $10, $15 a month to have an ability to demo every game. At least the vast majority of games, because the vast majority of games do come through Game Pass that you might be interested in on Xbox. To me, was worth it at the time to not, right, so that if I saw that I was going to have something that was going to break or my progression be limited, I would be like, okay, but, at least I didn't pay the $70 for that game. So, and that held me captive, for a while until prices started increasing. So this other news story, and I'm probably going to start kind of pushing so I can kind of wrap this up in this first segment. Resident Evil and Street Fighter franchises boost Capcom's latest financials. Operating income rose 75.1% to $352.6 million, with net sales growth of 29.8% to $748.8 million. So you talk about consumer protections. We're going to go through this, right? But I have a problem with this because Dragon's Dogma 2 does not perform well on PC. Monster Hunter Wilds does not perform well on PC. And yet, Capcom is raking in the dough, right, while issuing games that are not performing at launch and that they don't fix, right, over several months of time. Capcom has published its financial results for the 9 months ended December 31st, 2025, reporting significant increase across the board. The company saw a significant jump in its operating and net income, which rose by 75.1%. That's income, and then profits rose 68.6%. Net sales $748.8 million, up 29.8% year on year. Operating income $352.6 million, up 75.1% year on year. Net income $251.9 million, up 68.6% year on year. The highlights: in its digital contents business, Capcom reported net sales of $473.3 million, up 25.4% year on year. The company attributed this increase to its efforts in expanding catalog title sales, particularly with its Resident Evil and Street Fighter franchises. Looking at Resident Evil, the announcement of Resident Evil Requiem helped drive sales growth for titles in the same series, led by Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil Village. And so this is a recurring theme that we see where we see, like, Joseph Fares reported last year that, not only did Split Fiction itself move numbers, but in the walk-up to the launch of Split Fiction, you saw increased sales of It Takes Two, right? And so these are good, these are interesting things that, definitely, is part of the reasoning behind, well, why do you put out a bunch of Fallout games? Well, because you have a good Fallout TV show, and not a new version, but still that awareness and that putting that IP in the windshield of gamers makes people think, hey, I'll go pick up a copy of the old game. On mobile, Resident Evil Survivor Unit, okay, we're not going to read about mobile. As for Street Fighter, cumulative global sales of Street Fighter 6 surpassed 6 million units following the release of the Nintendo Switch 2 version. So that's also good to hear. That's actually a game that I was thinking about picking up on Switch 2. Capcom's Devil May Cry and Monster Hunter franchises also contributed to its earnings considerably during the fiscal period. It highlighted that sales of Devil May Cry 5 were strong due to coordinated price strategies with the Netflix adaptation, in similar vein to what I was just talking about with Fallout, alongside efforts to enhance brand value through building wider awareness of the IP. And so that's why the industry is all falling over themselves, right, to get video game TV shows, right, and movies out. Unit sales of Monster Hunter Rise and Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak continue to rise, while cumulative sales of Monster Hunter Wilds reached 11 million units following its February 2025 launch. And so, again, this is a repeating theme that we heard last year, which was that the problem, a problem with Monster Hunter Wilds is that they were actually seeing higher sales in some cases, in some months, of their older titles, Monster Hunter Rise and in fact, Monster Hunter Worlds as well. But it sounds like there's been some recovery in the sales pace of Monster Hunter Wilds kind of picking back up again. Overall, Capcom's digital content segment saw total unit sales of 34.64 million copies, up from 30.53 million sold during the previous fiscal period. Capcom also experienced a significant 73.5% increase in net sales within its amusement equipment segment, which includes smart... Okay, we don't care about that. Looking ahead, Capcom said it expects to achieve its projected earnings forecast for the current fiscal year ending March 31st, 2026, because before that happens, Resident Evil Requiem will launch, and I'm sure it will sell manga, and I'm sure it will help with financials. I am also sure that is part of the reason why it is shipping before financials close out, just like Dragon's Dogma 2 did. Hopefully, Resident Evil Requiem will not run like hot dog doo-doo like Dragon's Dogma 2 does. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk a ton about Xbox earnings. First of all, Brap and I talked about those extensively on Basement Radio Arcade podcast. And so if you want to go check that out, that was the show from Wednesday night. The thing that I want to add to this is that, again, the Xbox business unit was down 9% year over year for Q2. This is the holiday sales quarter. In most cases, you can kind of definitely make an argument that consumer electronics companies, consumer electronics value streams exist almost entirely for the holiday shopping quarter, right? You wind up everything that you do, right? So you can have the biggest party that is feasible in the holiday quarter. And this quarter for Xbox results in 9% down year over year. And last year, they were 7% down out of the holiday quarter. One of the things that I think needs to be talked about is in the year that's transpired, since they were down 7% and down 9% in the holiday shopping quarter, they have gone to the second year of putting Call of Duty in Game Pass. They have gone into the second year of shipping games on PlayStation 5. They have cut a huge amount of headcount. A huge amount of headcount. One of the principal ways in knocking down costs. And despite all of those measures, you are coming up short. I mean, I assume that the objective, right, that the desire was not for the gaming business unit to perform at 9% down. I assume that it was not intentional for the gaming business unit to have content and services down 5%. So I assume that the objectives you were pursuing, that the KPIs you were using, that the performance you wanted is not measuring up to what you wanted to have happen. Because in general, you don't sit in a boardroom and devise strategies to lose money. So one of the things that I think is a struggle, or is a question, or is a thing people should consider, is all of the ducks were in a row for this not to be the case, especially the huge cutting of headcount, the huge layoffs, shipping more games on multiple platforms, which is supposed to be the key to the future and the way you're supposed to be running the business. All the money's in software. Hardware doesn't matter. Blah, 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 blah. Right? That is what Xbox is doing. They are executing on that almost to its fullest extent. And in the second year of executing on that strategy, in the second year of removing the red line, in the second year of all of the things that are talked about, right, in the propaganda and the PR, the results are not only bad, they're actually getting worse. So, again, I think it's caused a question whether or not a lot of the things that are put out, right, by punditry and propaganda are the right thing. Maybe this turns around. Maybe I don't know. Maybe something changes. I don't know. But a lot of discussion that this isn't a big deal, this isn't a problem. I'm like, again, how can you be sitting here saying this is not a problem when it's right two holiday quarters of negative performance? And again, yes, they're part of a multi-trillion-dollar company. Again, my contention, people always say, Xbox is done, Xbox is cooked. They're getting out of this, they're getting out. Look, EA verily, and I say this for everybody in the multi-trillion-dollar club. These companies get out of businesses when they choose to. Nobody ran Google out of Stadia. Google made a decision to get out of Stadia, right? Nobody's going to tell Microsoft to get out of gaming. When Microsoft decides to get out of gaming, they will choose to get out of gaming. It'll be their decision. But I'm also not going to sit here and say, because they're backed by $1 trillion company, everything looks rosy and Tiffany couplings, because that is not the case. Like, if you've sat in a home economics class, you should be able to look at these financials and understand that. Okay, let's go on to this last one, because I thought this was a curiosity. It just came across my windshield kind of at the last minute, so I'm actually going through this for the first time. Amazon games boss Hartman reportedly leaving as firm retreats from PC and console. The head of Amazon Game Studios, Christoph Hartman, is reportedly leaving the company. Now, I assume this is the guy who took over. Oh no, Phil Harrison was at Google. Never mind. All right. That's according to Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, who took to Blue Sky to announce the job move. Amazon is also reportedly scaling back its PC and console games business, favoring its Luna cloud streaming service instead. That was announced in 2020, ahead of a 2023 launch. This news comes alongside Amazon announcing that it was making another round of layoffs. This time, 16,000 roles are to be impacted. With the company's Senior Vice President of People Experience and Technology, Beth Galetti, saying that this move was to reduce layers, increase ownership, and remove bureaucracy. This comes hot on the heels of another 14,000 people being laid off in October 2025. It's unclear whether Amazon's game business is being affected by this most recent wave of layoffs, but if the company is pulling back from PC and console, then it's certainly possible developers working in those areas will be impacted. In that October 25 round of layoffs, Amazon's games business saw cuts with significant role reductions at its Irvine and San Diego offices. That's on top of a reduction in the amount of work it does on big budget titles such as MMOs. So look, if you want to say Amazon is getting out of gaming and Amazon is cooked, okay, here we are. You're full on, batteries released. You could definitely make that assertion with regard to Amazon. You're seeing a lot of the same things that you saw when Google was backing out of Stadia, despite whatever it was saying. Hartman joined Amazon in 2018 as VP of Game Studios this followed an over 20-year stint at 2K Games, the venture that he had been president of since he co-founded the company back in 2005. Wow, really? So this guy founded 2K. Oh, 2K, not Take-Two. I always get that. So there's 2K, Take-Two, and then of course there's Rockstar itself, and I'm often confused. In fact, I would have to get it written down on a piece of paper and be looking at it to make sure that I understand it. If I'm not mistaken, 2K, I think, is the thing inside Take-Two. And it is a smaller publisher unit, and they're the guys who put out like PGA Tour 2K and NBA and WWE, and they are a subsidiary of Take-Two, which is the thing that is headed by Strauss Zelnick. Okay, so again, definitely looks like Amazon is winding down. Christoph Hartmann leaving. It's an interesting blip on the landscape because we're in this time where I think Netflix is continuing to pursue gaming. They're making some adjustments, but I don't think that their adjustment is to be less aggressive. Maybe from a quantification standpoint, in terms of maybe they aren't going to invest as much, but it's still a bullish push, and I suspect that it will incorporate Warner Brothers IP if they go through with that acquisition. I know they made the statement that we didn't add any money to the valuation, or their statement was we didn't see any value or whatever in the deal that we offered to Warner Brothers for the gaming division. People took that to mean Netflix didn't care about Warner Brothers. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is when they laid the puzzle pieces out on the floor and they said, what dollar value are we going to attach to each of these things? I think their claim, and I think it's a public claim, was that we didn't add any money to the deal for Warner Brothers games, right? If you don't want to give us Warner Brothers games, then you guys can deal with it, right? We're not going to give you any extra money for that. But I think they are absolutely interested in Warner Brothers games. I think the strength of gaining DC Comics, all the Warner Brothers IP movie making stuff, and then putting hopefully good savvy leadership right in charge of games to drive that in a combinatorial way, right, to push comic book character IP in comics, make good movies out of them, make good TV shows out of them, and put them on Netflix as exclusives, and also make good video games out of them. I think it's just a natural thing you would want to do as a business if you're going and ponying up, billions of dollars to buy Warner Brothers. So hopefully that's the way it will go. I would like to see more DC Comics video games. Great Scott, why hasn't anybody made a great Green Lantern game? So hopefully, things like that will come down the pike. All right, let's go ahead and that's going to wrap us up for segment 1. And then we will flash away and do segment 2 here tomorrow. And then hopefully Kate stay on schedule for putting this episode up tomorrow, the 30th of January. So let's go ahead and head out and go on to segment 2. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back for segment 2. One bit of cleanup from yesterday that I wanted to mention, that I forgot to mention yesterday with regards to looking at Xbox business unit performance. In addition to the significant reduction in headcount, the other thing that should have helped financial performance from last year between the Q2 2025 results that we looked at, or 2024 results that got reported last January versus the year-over-year holiday quarter 2025 results that got reported earlier this week, was that there were also a large number of project cancellations, right? And so removing headcount should have hit fringe and overhead and helped reducing those costs. But then the direct labor charges that would have been part of your capital, or would have been part of your project cancellations, and would have shown up on your books, right, as capital expense investment. Sometimes companies put them in the R&D column on their GAAP reports when you're making software that you're not recognizing revenue on yet, right, before it actually goes on sale. So that should have also come off the top, right, in terms of cost. And so despite a significant reduction in headcount, and let's keep in mind that about 4,500 gaming unit employees have been laid off since the acquisition closed in 2023, right? So over roughly 2 years plus, a significant amount of overhead has been reduced out of that business unit in the gaming division. And then the project cancellation sort of also resulted in significant cost reductions, in addition to the direct labor / capital investment R&D charges that for investment in software development. The other thing you would have eliminated would have been the cost, any of those costs associated with contract labor, but more specifically contract work, right? So Crystal Dynamics now off the books, Avalanche now off the books. Anything that you were funding externally that was canceled now off the books. And so it's a very curious state of affairs that those things have occurred, and yet the business unit is down 9% overall, and content and services is down 5% year over year. So it's not a great set of optics, and of course, it's up to Microsoft to figure out what to do about that. Want to go on and talk about and the other thing is, so because I had the way I had things sized in the lower panel window for the browser, and they're not huge, so this isn't a week where you're going to really, be able to look at those things in detail, but just had them there for situational awareness for SA. Some of the graphics didn't show up, and some of the graphics were off center because of the way I had sized the window. So, just a reminder. As much as possible, but I mean, I'd be perfect, but as much as possible, anything that I'm pulling for reference documents, those links will be in the show notes. And so just want to remind people, the point of this podcast, and quite frankly, the point of any podcast that you see me or hear me on, because this is a point that I reiterate. My point in having these conversations isn't so I can, draw huge accolades to myself, or, put a graphic, a scrolling graphic underneath, my camera, my webcam port on a podcast, calling myself Mr. 98% right all the time. I think there's enough foolishness, and there's enough Geraldo Rivera, Jerry Springer, Maury Povich characters and clowns out there, proclaiming things like that, going on in the gaming content space. And so if that's what you're looking for, for content for console warriors, for platform warriors, that content is out there. That's not what this is. Hopefully, and I constantly say, you shouldn't be taking anything that I say and going out and preaching it as gospel. The point of having these conversations, and the reason I've isolated a lot of these topics to the solo cast, is so that people can come here. If something that I say causes you to kind of cock your head to the side, be curious, say, I'm not certain about that, and causes you to think, my hope and my belief is that you would go to the references in the show notes. You would then go pull your own threads, pull your own information, maybe bounce it off some colleagues, and have a conversation about it. The point of this show, and a lot of the other things that I do, is to cause people to hopefully think and consider something. The only people who should be watching this particular podcast should be people who consider themselves students of the industry and are really trying to understand the business and technological underpinnings of the gaming industry. This isn't a show for people to watch to, accumulate points to go out and weaponize in the ongoing platform war. That's why I've pulled myself and my content out of that Twitter, YouTube circle of constant conflict and, and whatever that goes on. So again, if there were graphics you didn't see, if there was something that I pulled that I wasn't certain on, because quite frankly, I research a lot of these things and then tape it, and I may do that, several days after I pulled the reference. So if there was any confusion like that, those things will be in the show notes for you to go look at yourself. Okay, let's start with today's first topic, which is the GDC State of the Game Industry Report. So this is something that I look at every year, and I really like looking at it. But I want to put out one cautionary tale when we look at this. Again, back on the topic of using the data to weaponize, right, to go out and have platform warrior conversations. We should recognize that this is a survey. This is people reporting on what they feel and what they think. You have a situation at GDC where there are people who aren't going to be there, right? And so probably your very large development teams that are working on getting a game out here shortly, such as the people working on Resident Evil, or people who are working on big gas games, right, who just recently launched, they may not be at GDC, and so their opinions may not be kind of hoovered up in this. I'm not necessarily saying that that would skew the data, but my point is that there are people who are not participating in the survey. Then you have, of the people who are going, the ones who choose to not submit, right? So this gives you a data point and a perspective. It's not necessarily ground truth. There's a lot of information in here that says people want to develop for PC. And we just need to understand, again, going back to a lot of the data that I iterate. So the end result of that, the end result of 80% of the market, or whatever, 80% of the suppliers wanting to develop for PC, is they wind up pushing 19,000 games to Steam a year. And of those, a single-digit number of percentage games, of new games released in that year, will make 91%, right, of the revenue of new games. And then a single-digit percentage of games will make over 100K. So if lots of those are indie projects, you have a very small percentage of them that are profitable, because it takes about 100K at least to pay the salary of even an entry level developer these days. So you have a lot of these games that wind up not being profitable, not successful by a KPI benchmark, right, metric. And so we need to take that into consideration when we're looking at this data. So at any rate, I think there's only really like two major things that I wanted to point out in here. I won't go over everything. This report is available over at GDC. You just put in like some contact information and you can make that up. And then they give you access to the report. They give you access to the report directly in the browser, and then they email it to you, right? So a lot of information here on like the globalization of software development. I don't think we'll go through this. I've talked about the demographics of the kind of labor category split last year, a few years ago maybe, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. Company size, I think this was one thing that I thought was interesting. 30% of the people surveyed say that they are part of a company that is 250 plus people. So in addition to studio workers, there were consultants and independent contractors, 7%, game publisher employees, 5%, and those who work support services like game technology and distribution, 5%. We had over 100 respondents who work in support services, with their top fields being software and middleware, 25%, game engine technology, 17%, and software as a service, 16%. About 4% of respondents identified as full-time solo developers, and 4% said they work as part-time solo developers. So you have 22% of people who were in companies 10 to 49 people, 27% that were in company sizes 50 to 249 people, 30% 250 plus people. So 30%, so 57, so 79%, like 80% of the people interviewed. No, I won't include the 10 to 49. Let's include the 50 and above. So 57% of the people were in companies 50 people and larger. Now, when you get into company sizes like that and you look at, say, port studios, so a lot of your port studios are right at about 100 people, right? So when you talk about Nix's, when you talk about Bluepoint, those are about 100 people. Then when you look at Visual, I can't remember what their name is, but I think they're the guys who did the port of Forza Horizon to PlayStation 5, I think. Those are companies that are large scale, that do nothing but contract work, and so I want to say they're like in the thousands of people. So one thing to kind of think about is that a large number of it's two things. You can take this data to mean that there's a large bulk of the gaming market that is people that are working in larger size companies. You can also take it to mean people who work at larger size companies are the people who tend to go to GDC, people who probably, tend to maybe the company is able to provide some funding for, part of their travel. I'm not sure, but I think, part of the thing that I would consider is that a lot of the people who are out at GDC are from these larger companies. So there's information in here on layoffs and the large number of people, basically, if you're standing in a room of 4 developers, there's going to be a number of them that have been impacted by a layoff at some point in their career. I don't think that's something that we need to go over. Generative AI, I'm not particularly interested in looking at the metrics on that. I'm sure everybody thinks that it's bad, but then there's also numbers here that indicate a lot of people use it, and then there's various purposes for which people use it, but not too worried about that. I thought this was the thing that was interesting. So it's full Steam Deck ahead. Unreal surpasses Unity. So what game engine do you primarily use for game development? 42% of respondents said Unreal. 30% said Unity. 19% said proprietary in-house. What game engine do you primarily use for game development? Business model and studio type. So for premium games, it's Unreal Engine that's primarily in use. 28%, 45% on Unreal, 28% Unity, and 20% proprietary in-house. So it's very interesting that a fifth of game development uses, for premium games, uses proprietary in-house. And so that's going to be an interesting metric to see. I think this, for me, from my perspective, this is a thing that corroborates how much effort and investment is still going into exclusives, because obviously that would include PlayStation, who works on proprietary engines. I think we see Xbox taking a retreat from the use of primary engines and swerving its development over primarily to Unreal Engine. AAA developers, 47% of them use Unreal Engine, 44% use proprietary in-house, so that further reinforces that point that I just talked about. That for AAA games, and I think this, again, if you're using a proprietary in-house engine, there's one of two reasons you're using it. Either you're operating at scale and you don't want to pay the money to Epic. And so when you look at EA using Frostbite, when you look at Ubisoft using Snowdrop, those people are using their own in-house engines. And then the other people are making exclusive content who are using their own in-house engines, because again, they're not going to necessarily pay that money to Epic. AA uses Unreal, and that makes sense, right? So smaller teams trying to work at a larger scale are going to lean more heavily on middleware and outsourced tools and utilities, and try and bypass the cost of building those in-house. Newer indie studios also, that's pretty evenly split between Unreal Engine and UE. And then older indie studios, you'd thank John Rotella for that. Older indie studios majority use Unity at 54%. And that makes sense because I think Unity was more popular before they went scorched earth and burned a lot of their trust and goodwill amongst the development community. And then Epic capitalized on that by swooping in and sweetening the pot with some of the licensing deals that they made to take advantage of Unity being down bad. So I think older indie studios, it's upended because those people were already embedded in those tools. And then I think as newer indie studios have come into the fold, they've leaned, there's more of a parity split between Unreal and Unity. What are your company's top factors for choosing a platform to release a game? This is the thing that I found most interesting. 78% said audience reach. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have that meaning three things, right? It's going to mean PC, it's going to mean PlayStation, and it's going to mean mobile. The quote in here is, finding the right platform for your game can be a daunting task, but it is key to finding success in an often overcrowded marketplace. We asked respondents what factors take top priority in deciding what platforms to put their games on. According to our survey, audience reach 78% is most important, followed by business model success 44% and discoverability 43%. I think, again, this is the balance, right? So yes, audience reach, right? You probably want to go to PC, but then you have a discoverability problem, right? And so people are going to try and find balance, right, in platforms that they go to. One of the things I talk about is obviously this is going to be an Xbox problem, and I constantly talk about people who seem to want to make up reasons for the fact that developers sometimes choose to skip Xbox. Guys, it's very simple. It's right here. It's because the audience reach isn't there. It's because if you put the game on Xbox, you're going to get to a very small number of users. And I'm talking about the console hardware platform, right? And obviously people are saying here that is one of their primary key drivers, and so that is also going to be the primary key reason that they choose to potentially not go to Xbox. Some of the quotes here. What are your thoughts on the value of paid subscription libraries for games? Apple Arcade, Xbox Game Pass. Can be initially good for consumers, but not great for indie developers or non-live ops games, which in the long run may hurt consumers. That's from a senior VP from a payment processing firm in California. And so payment processing firms are some of the middleware that some of these particularly smaller developers lean on. And so these guys see all of the transactions going back and forth because they're the middle person. And so if you look at a lot of the mobile kind of telemetry companies that put out a lot of the data-driven assessments of what's going on in the mobile market, several of them are payment processing firms. From a okay, so I think this is from an equity investment firm or venture capital. I think they can be valuable if developers are given fair equity in the subscription model, and so that's if the deals are good. And we heard a couple of years ago that as we got past kind of the inception and the hard push for a la carte subscription services, that the deals are not as preferable, right, as they were before. A director from a live ops and analytics company, mixed thoughts. If a player is dedicated to a specific brand, then it provides great benefits to the player. So Game Pass. I guess to a certain extent, maybe Apple Arcade. Just because the people who are in an Apple Arcade are probably big Apple enthusiasts, right? You have to have enough of your leg in the pool, right, of your body in the pool. It's not just a toe dip in the Apple ecosystem for Apple Arcade to make sense. However, many of these platforms are lacking in trackable metrics and player behavior between the player purchasing a premium game and engaging with a premium game as part of the subscription service. These two player behaviors are vastly different, and it causes the developer to not have accurate retention and acquisition data, resulting in inefficient choices in how to best serve their communities. This quote from a consultant: subscription libraries can change the perception of the value of games and the expected attention time. This works well with mobile because of the monetization challenges. The benefit for traditional box titles is still to be proven in the long run. Another quote from somebody in the C-suite, I guess from a game publishing company. For us at the mid-size indie scale, these buyouts provide significant operational revenue for both us and our developers. We often make more from business dev deals than unit sales. So I can't tell if this is a person who's running a subscription service or putting their game. I think it's a person putting their games in a subscription service, and I think what they're saying is that, right, this is kind of the middle ground, right? So they're working at scale, so they're looking at things from a more of a corporate financial perspective than a small business financial perspective. Those are different dynamics. And what they're saying is, when we go into a subscription service, they get a significant amount of operational revenue from that subscription content buyer that balances out their risk for them on where they are, because they're carrying significant expense, right? This is not a small mom and pop shop garage level operation. And so those points where they buy down risk wind up being good for them, probably in kind of the output gamble of buy versus subscribe. ROI of these, this is from a director who works in community support, I guess, at a publisher. ROI of these models is falling and not a long-term strategy. The impact of being on Game Pass and other subscription platforms is not what it used to be. So I'm not going to get into my personal assessment of what I think about those quotes. Just like I said, I'll read them out. I read them out. I'll put the links in the show notes, and people can make their own assessment. Which platforms have been used for your most recent game project? 83% say PC, 47% say PlayStation 5 or 5 Pro, 40% say Xbox, 28% say Steam Deck. And then some things to go down from here. So when we talk about the Steam Deck metric, right, I think what we need to understand is that first of all, it means, I don't know if there's double dipping in here. I suspect that there is. But, so let me assume that means, number one, they made the game for PC. So they're part of the 83%. And out of those 83%, 28% of them, let's just call it a third, specifically went in and tweaked that game to make sure that it worked on Steam Deck, right? That it passed certification for Steam Deck. There's a smaller number for Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2. I find that very kind of interesting. And there's several other platforms in here. 8% on Xbox Cloud Gaming, 5% on ROG Xbox Ally X. ROG Xbox Ally, rather. Only 2% on UGC platforms. So again, a lot of rage going on about, Roblox and Minecraft, and that's the way of the future. Only 2% of the people attending, at least attending GDC, right, made their stuff for Roblox. And so I guess that the people who are making that content, don't attend GDC. And I don't know how many are out there saturating the market. When it comes to platforms themselves, PC remains at the top with 83% of survey developers currently making games for it and 80% saying they're interested in doing so. More developers are working on games for PlayStation 5 hardware than Xbox Series X. PlayStation also outranks Xbox in developer interest, with twice as many respondents wanting to make games for the PS5 than the Xbox. So there's two different charts here. There's what platform did you target for either your last or your ongoing project, and then for your next gig after this, what platform are you looking at? So we see a difference in the numbers here. It doesn't. We actually see a reduction, right, and slight reduction in PlayStation 5, slight reduction in PC also, which doesn't really make a ton of sense, but it's so small that it looks like it's in the noise. We actually see a rise when we talk about what are you targeting next, significant rise in Steam Deck and Nintendo Switch 2. So I think this is part of kind of the production tail, right? So whatever people worked on last and whatever people are working on now wasn't targeting the Switch 2. Now that people are seeing the success of the Switch 2 in terms of unit sales, they're thinking, okay, the next thing that I'm going to work on is definitely going to target that platform, because that makes sense. PlayStation also outranks Xbox in developer interest, with twice as many respondents wanting to make games for the PS5 than the Xbox. We've also seen a possible decrease in Xbox cloud gaming services, with 8% of developers making games for the platform compared to 13% of developers in similar roles last year. Newly added for 2026, Valve's Steam Deck has already become the fourth most used platform on the market, at least according to our survey, with 28% of developers making or optimizing games for the PC handheld. In addition, 40% of developers said they're interested in making games for Steam Deck, putting it on par with the newer Nintendo Switch 2. I think part of what we're seeing, too, is because Steam Machine, right, is not in the survey, I think what we're also seeing is, hey, if I'm going to make a game for PC, it also behooves me to, again, go in and do any special tweaking and tuning that I need to do for it to run on Steam Deck, because that's also me doing the work for Steam Machine as well, I think is what's really kind of behind these numbers. Other PC handhelds don't seem to have caught on quite yet, with interest for ROG, Xbox Ally, and similar handhelds sitting at 7% and 6% respectively. It's important to note that the survey opened before the announcement of the new Steam Machine and Steam Frame VR headset, so they were not included, but it's possible the announcement impacted developer interest in Steam products, right? So what it's saying is the announcement wasn't out yet, but developers probably already knew, and so this is probably an embedded dynamic in the metrics. It also closed before Meta announced cuts in its Reality Labs division focused on VR, so that information would have no bearing on these results. And so next year you may see like a shift in numbers out of VR that will result in an increase in numbers in other platforms. Again, those numbers will be small because the VR, AR, MR numbers are like 8% of what people were working on now. That UGC number actually reduced it actually increased slightly from 2% to 4%. When you talk about what you're working on now to what you're working on next. For what you're working on next and what I'm targeting, the survey came back with 80% for PC, 40% for PlayStation 5, 40% for Steam Deck, 39% for Switch 2, 20% for Xbox Series X S. Trying to see if there's anything. What was the Linux number? I'm not seeing a direct jump out of the Linux number from what people were working on before, so it looks like they added that for this year. The new number. That's weird. I was just looking at it. Is 12%. So I think what that represents is that there's a push for maybe making a new. Well, I don't have last year's data to compare it to, but what I will say, it's not an insignificant number that are looking at alternative operating system platforms, and possibly in conjunction with the rise of the Steam Deck and the Steam Machine, looking to put skin on making native Linux games. Because I think that's where really we make a large hullabaloo about like games going to Steam Deck and maybe now to Steam Machine, but just remember, like that's not indicative of a rise in interest in making games for Linux. Those are games made for Windows that work through a translation layer that now also work on Linux. I think the real payoff is if there's market interest, there's industry encouragement to make native games for Linux, and so to me it's good to see that here at 12%. It's also good to see the Mac number at 12% as well. Top 5 platforms free to play: PC 60%, 68%, Android and iOS at 57 and 55, PlayStation 5 and Xbox 38 and 31. So when you talk about making a free-to-play game, people are targeting PC and mobile. When you talk about a premium game, 88% target PC, 55% PlayStation, 47% Xbox, 32% Steam Deck. Of course, again, those 32% are inherently, in my mind, embedded in the 88%, and 25% on for Xbox One. And then there's some so I don't see anything else, particularly interesting in this. Okay. Let's go on and talk about the PC Market Reality Price Tracker. This is an exercise that I started earlier this month, mid-month, where I'm templating some builds. What would Logic do about a new build, and then tracking those prices to see if there's any reality in the London Bridge is falling down perspective of, oh my God, it's the end of the DIY market. You guys are going to be paying 5 times as much. RAM prices are going to impact everything. Again, I contend that that's a bunch of foolishness, but we'll see, and we'll see if I'm wrong. For my high-end DIY upgrade package, the Ryzen 9950X3D, there's been no change in price, and so the last refresh was Friday, the 23rd of January. These are my price refreshes as of today. 9950X3D, no change. The Kraken Elite started tracking at 280 last week. It had gone up to 290. It's actually down, available for 280 now, and I found that on both Amazon and Best Buy. The MSI Mag B850 Tomahawk motherboard, no change in price there. The major impact here this week was RAM again. The Crucial Pro 32GB, which I started tracking at 275, moved up to 325. That kit is now at 360, and so that's even outside the bounds of my own thumb rule, and well outside the bounds. I didn't really consider the 325 a big deal, and there was a kit available for 305 last week as well. At this point, because one of the things I want to talk through here is when pricing becomes contentious, what do you do, right? What's your analysis? What choice do you make as a consumer? Rather than falling down in a pit of your own despair and throwing a temper tantrum and crying and acting helpless. What do you actually do? And so I think at this point, if it were me, if I were going to do a high-end DIY upgrade, I would look at the Crucial 32GB DDR5 RAM. Now, that is a single stick. It does not have a heat spreader, but I'm probably now in a position where I need to slum it, right? I need to buy something that, again, if I had to do a build or an upgrade, I would probably buy something that would not necessarily be my optimal choice, but would be good enough, and then look at correcting that later. And so right now, I would probably go and buy the 32GB RAM kit without the heat spreader for $340, right? And to get by, because that's better than paying $360, right, for the other thing. The case that I have spec'd out, the Fractal Design North XL dark case, no change in price there. It's still $195. The Corsair RMX 1000 watt PSU. was actually down a little bit from the last uptick. It was 180 when I started tracking it. That was the sales price. It jumped up to 255 last week. It is now down to being available for 210, and I'm pretty sure again that I found those prices on both Amazon and Best Buy. And so I didn't refresh the total package pricing last week, but when I started tracking this, so if I needed to do what I call a foundational, right, an upgrade for my foundational build, so that's not including the GPU, SSD, and SSDs. It does include RAM because I would have to go from AM4 to AM5. That package initially started tracking at about 1815. It is now up to 1910. So it's about a price increase of about $100 here, which for me would not make me flip out or like not do an upgrade. It would just be, I wish it was wish it was closer to 1800 than 1900, right? For the pre-built that I have spec'd out, which is a Corsair Vengeance 3500X, the spec for that build, I think it's actually been retired. That 7800, yeah, that 7800, yes, that 7800 X3D build is out of stock. Corsair has replaced it with a build that is powered by a 9800 X3D. So that's good, right, in terms of power. Just a reminder, as I talked about last segment, problems with the 9800 X3D on ASRock and Asus boards. There's also a problem, like I said, which is not a manufacturing problem, but I think that problem is being driven by motherboard vendors being super aggressive about the voltages that they're allowing to run on these CPU sockets. And so the conventional wisdom right now is to down voltage very slightly, power going to your CPU, and then that should help you avoid those problems. So everything else is the same. So it's still an 850 watt PSU, 1 terabyte NVMe SSD, 240 millimeter AIO. Again, not something that I would prefer to buy, but we may be in times where you got to do what you got to do. It's now bumped up to a 9800 X3D CPU. It's still 32 gigabytes of RAM. It's an RTX 5070 Ti, and it's on an 8X870 motherboard. It is for the same price, so you can go and order that right now for $2,700. It is back ordered to February 5th. So again, I wouldn't personally flip out about that. If you started seeing like that back order duration sliding out to the right, that would be something that would make me feel a little sketchy, and maybe not plunk down for that. But that's where it is right now. The gaming laptops that I priced, the MSI Vector 16HX, which runs an RTX 5070 Ti, slight price increase from 1730 to 1762, just call it 1765. And then the Thunderobot Radiant, I had this down as Thunderbolt, the Thunderobot Radiant 16, which also runs an RTX 5070 Ti and comes in a little cheaper, is the same price at $1699. Now, this week, the template that I'm adding is, what would I do if I had to do a mid-grade DIY upgrade? And so what a mid-grade DIY upgrade is for me is, it is really just the tick-tock of upgrading the GPU. And so typically I try and do a foundational upgrade at one point. Let's say I did that in 2026, and then I would look to upgrade the GPU like 6 months to a year later. I typically tend to not do them concurrently at the same time. And even if I were building an entirely new build, what I would probably do is buy all the foundational parts, and I would probably just stick in a GPU that I have sitting on the shelf right now as a spare part, and run that right for a number of months, and then buy the GPU. So right now, if I had to do a mid-grade DIY upgrade, what I would do is I would take my lowest spec box, which is an AMD an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, and an RTX 3080 Ti. And so that RTX 3080 Ti is the thing that's getting a little long in the tooth. I would probably want to bring something up to current generation. Now, the rest of my lab runs a 5080, a 4080, and two 4070 Super, so I'd be looking to get something in above the 4070 Super, but probably not necessarily close to the 5080. So when I basically I'm looking at the 5070 Ti or the 5070. The 5070 Ti, a little too expensive and also a little too close to the performance profiles that I already have available on the 4080 and the 5080. So I'm probably going to go a little lower to the 5070, and that allows me to test things at the high end and more of the middle for the current generation. So right now what this will hit a lot of the doomsaying about, the 5070 and the 5070 Ti and SKUs being retired and all of this stuff. So maybe that's going to happen. I don't know. We're going to put it on the chart here and actually track it in reality. So right now, if I had to buy a mid-grade DIY upgrade, I would get this MSI Gaming RTX 5070, which is a 12 gigabyte card, obviously GDDR7. It isn't at 620, so MSRP for the 5070 should be 550. So this is paying a little bit over MSRP. It is not paying as much over MSRP as you would have to do for a 5070 Ti right now. So again, this is about like, what would I do if I had to go out and buy something right now? And so that's where we will start tracking on it, and then we will see how it progresses after that throughout the year. So hopefully I put out some decent information that at least, gave people some things to consider this episode. I'm going to go ahead and try and get this posted here very shortly. Thanks so much for anybody who happens to swing by and watch this archive version, video on demand, on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. I appreciate you. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content, and I will get another episode up someday next week. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, play the games that you like, come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. That show airs 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sunday evening, so please feel free to swing by. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.